Hello everybody, Louis here, the instructor for the Robotic Planet course on CG Boost. So you've finished modeling your new shiny product viz, prop or character, whatever really. However, although you have some nice lighting and cameras, there's still something missing, something you can't quite put your finger on. Ah yes, the void, the infinite default background. It mocks you. It knows you don't have time to create a whole environment. You've just spent hundreds of hours modeling your main model. In this video, we'll look at 4 quick techniques in both EV and cycles to add a little bit of extra polish and atmosphere to your models. First up is Radial Glows. You no doubt have seen this in product photography. The concept of having a strong backlight to draw attention to, in most cases, the object in the center of frame. Now we could use a light as well, and maybe even set up light linking to restrict said light falling onto our main model. However, this doesn't work too well for EV, at the moment at least. And we can create a similar effect with a plane and a simple shader setup, so let's look at that. Okay, let's get creating our Radial Glow backlight. First things first, let's make sure our cursor is in the world origin. So Shift S, cursor to world origin, and then Shift A, mesh, plane. Now I'm going to scale this up a considerable amount and then hit R to rotate on the X 90 degrees. And then we can hit G, move it behind a little bit, rotate it on the Z, and generally position it so it's in the background as dictated by the relationship between our camera and said object. So something like that looks good. Now, if you are a little bit more of an experienced user, you might want to set up a track constraint so our background plane always looks at the camera. However, I'm keen to keep a little bit of parallax in the scene, which we'll see a little bit later. Now we need to create a new material. So going over to material options with the plane selected, just click new, and we're going to call this BG Glow. And I'm going to drag up a new window here so we can switch on over to Shader Editor. And you can see we have our principal BSDF already hooked up. However, we only need to take advantage of a few inputs here so we can reduce our base color, effectively killing the diffuse. And then under specular, our IOR level, we can just take this down to nothing. This is the same as removing spec as you may be used to in the previous versions of Blender. And with that done, we can move down to our emission here and just give it a background color. I'm going to choose a kind of cyan-y blue type color, increase the strength to 1 here so we can see it. Okay, now we need to hook something up to our alpha here. So we can click and drag out from the input and release, and then search for gradient. And we want our gradient texture factor. And we want to change from linear to spherical. Now you can see we have a bit of a sphere here, starting from the very corner of our plane. And in order to remedy that, we can hook up some coordinates. So if we drag out again and start typing coordinates, we can choose texture coordinate object. Now it's in the center. But we're not really seeing any transparency or any blended gradient here. So we can remedy that by going back over to our material options, scrolling down to the bottom here and changing our blend mode to alpha blend and our shadow mode to none, as we don't really want to be receiving or casting shadows. Now the fall off for me is a little bit too linear here. So what I'm going to do is introduce a gamma node after our gradient texture. So Shift and A, search, gamma, and increase this gamma value so we have a nice soft fall off. And what this gamma effectively does is similar to RGB curves. It's kind of doing this effect, but in a handy single numerical field. I think that's added quite a bit of appeal already. However, we can go one step further by introducing a little bit of blended texture. So I'm going to select Musgrave for our texture of choice. Future Louis here. It's been noted by a fellow CG Boost member that the Musgrave texture is likely to be absorbed into the noise texture in following releases of Blender. So if you can't find it, that's where it's hiding. So let's search for that. And we want to multiply it over our existing node stack here. So let's introduce a math node, hook that up, change it to multiply, and hook up our Musgrave texture. Now, I'm going to hook up the object coordinate also to our vector, so we have a nice uniform scale. And then here we can reduce the scale a little bit. I'm going to turn up the detail so we get some nice granular detail, and decrease dimension. You can start to see what's happening there. Now, this is a little bit too contrasty for my liking, so for our last node, we'll introduce a map range. And here we can take the effective blacks, the minimum value here, and just give it a negative number, and our effective whites, or our maximum value, give that over a number over 1. And a little bit more tweaking. Yeah, I think that looks good. I encourage you as well to experiment with these radial glows because they can be used in interesting ways. So for example, we were to duplicate our material here and just plug this in, give this one a slightly different, perhaps warmer color, and put it in front of our object here. We could introduce some nice kind of sun glare from a side, assuming our key light is off to the left here, or create another duplicate, scale it down, and create a more obvious kind of lens flare or something as well. But, you know, feel free to experiment. Don't get me wrong, I think that a lot of model renders don't need a floor plane at all and look great just hovering in space. But for others, it makes sense to make them feel a bit more grounded. By the way, if you like creating robots like this, I created a course on CG Boost, link in the description. Right, back to creating the floor plane. Okay, I'm just going to give ourselves a little bit more room here. And again, in the world origin, we can create Shift-A, mesh plane, and scale it up again with S. Something like that looks good. Now over to our material options, new, and we can just call it ground plane. Now dragging back up our shader editor, I'm going to reduce the base color down considerably and then hook something up to our alpha, again by clicking and dragging out. And again, we want gradient factor. Just make sure the coordinates are object and our linear is set to spherical. And again, because I am using Eevee, we need to jump over to our material options, scroll all the way down, and change our blend mode from opaque to alpha hashed, which greatly improves the ability for Eevee to receive shadows on that surface and also the screen space reflections. If we switch back and forth here, you can see what I mean. And alpha clip as well is a binary alpha, so it's either 100% or nothing, and we don't want that either. So we're going to have to go with alpha hashed. Now, you may also notice that it's a little bit noisier, so when we do eventually go to render things, we need to crank up the samples to something like 200. Anyway, back to the shader. Like before, if we introduce a gamma node here, we can tweak that fall off to taste. Thinking something dark is quite nice. I might reduce that base color a little more and hit S on the actual object to scale it up. I think that looks considerably more grounded. Okay, let's dive into some geometry nodes to create some dust. Now, I unfortunately suffer from allergies, so I'm a little bit hesitant to go through this one, but I'm hoping, being that the dust is contained within Blender, the effects should be mild. Now, in order to have dust, we need to create a dust container first, so I'm just going to give our viewport a little bit more room here. And this time to create a cube, I'm going to go down to our Make Primitive option over here. And then I'm going to click on the back corner here on our already existing ground plane and drag out the base profile of our dust container cube. And then we can release and extrude up like so. And this I am making sure encompasses the camera as well. So we get dust particles very close to the camera that with a little bit of depth of field can look really, really nice. Okay, with that done and the cube selected, we can go over to our modifier options and add a new modifier, geometry nodes. Clicking new, and we'll call it dust. Now again, we can expand out our shader editor, switch it on over to our geometry node editor, and start setting things up. Now we need our dust to exist within the volume of the cube. So to do that, we need to tell it to be a volume. And we can do that with a mesh to volume node. So if we shift an A in our geometry nodes editor and search for mesh to, there we have it, volume. Now we have some nice as if fog really in our scene, but we don't want to use that. We want to distribute points within it. So let's search for distribute points in volume. That's what we're after. Now the points we can see in our solid view here aren't seen in our EV render. So let's fix that by instancing something on them. So let's search for instance on points. Let's hook that up. And we can drag out from our instance over here and choose the icosphere mesh. And these are effectively our points of dust or pollen or whatever. To make it a little bit more or a little bit less uniform, we can also search for set position, hook that up. And on our offset here, we can search for noise texture color. And the reason we are using color is because it handily has 3 channels, RGB, that all look slightly different, and those hook up nicely to the XYZ of our offset set position. Okay, now we can reduce quite considerably the size of our particles here. Just going to zoom in for a closer look, and we can play around with the texture scale until we have something that what I might think a piece of pollen or dust might look like. Okay, that's looking reasonably good. But again, they're all faced in the same direction, so we can use the input of our rotation here, search for random value, make sure that that is on vector, and then we can increase the max value, increase the min value, and there we have some nicely rotated and randomized particles. And you can see already, as we have depth of field enabled here, that we're getting some quite nice effects, some nice out of focus areas here. Now I know there are probably at least some of you out there that are a sucker for that defocus bokeh look, the circles of confusion that appear with small strong points of light. So let's increase that effect when creating the shader for our dust. So in order to select our dust here, it's kind of hard to see in the viewport, but I'm just going to drag out where I know it is here. So there it is. And moving over to our material options here, we can add a new material. Let's call it dust. And a base color, we can reduce that down, maybe make it kind of a brown or something like that. Now you'll notice when I am drastically increasing and decreasing these values, it doesn't seem to update in our viewport here. And this is because we are affecting our original box. We're not really affecting the particles within. So we need to jump back in to our geometry nodes, and at the end of the chain here, we need to add a set material and assign our dust. Great. However, this has knocked back that cool out of focus look. So we're going to jump into our dust shader, switch on over our geometry nodes editor to our shader editor, and we're going to add some tiny flakes of emission into it so we get that nice bokeh ball effect. So let's drop down our emission here. And on our strength, we're going to drag that out and we're going to search for random. Object info random, that's what we want. So in a random fashion, they are being affected by our emission, but we don't want them to be so, I guess, uniform again. We want to restrict just how many are emitting light. So let's search for our math node and change it to greater than, plug that in and give it a very high threshold. I'm thinking 0.98 or something like that. And to just increase the effect, I'm going to duplicate our math node, change it to multiply, hook that up, change the output value to 50 or something. And now you can see we have the odd point of light that is very, very bright. I'm just going to change this to a more sort of tungsten kind of color. Yeah, that looks nice. Now this greater than effect, if you are not familiar, does something quite similar to the color ramp if it were set to constant and given a very high value here as well. It's taking the random range of numbers and it's cutting out 90, or in this case 98% of them. Okay, I think that's looking really good. However, when we move around, our particles follow in a static manner, which isn't particularly realistic. So let's look at how we can introduce some subtle motion. So in order to animate our geometry nodes, we need to switch ourselves back to the geometry node editor, and we need to affect the position of our points. So if we move these 3 nodes back, this is the area we are working within. And we can use the set position here we've already created by Shift and D and moving it up here. And now you can see we can move our points along each axis. Now to move them gently over time, we can drag out from our offset over here and add our good friend the noise texture again with the color input, but this time switching it over to 4D. This gives you another dimension marked as W to evolve the noise pattern. And now if we jump in to our side view here and zoom into our particles a little bit for a slightly better look, you can see if we animate this W, our particles move ever so slightly. So to automate this input, we can drag out and search for time frame. So now when we hit play, our particles, well, they're all over the place, frantically moving around. So to limit that effect, let's search for our math node, change it to multiply and multiply this value by, let's start with 0.1. Okay, let's go with 0.001. All right, now we're talking. It's a little bit more realistic. So with a little more adjustment of scale, we start to get a nice bit of ambient dust animation. Looking good. Okay, that's quite a few nodes already, and it is often handy to mute certain chains of nodes to see what we're doing. Thankfully, there's a handy shortcut to do that, which is Control Alt, right click and drag, and this mutes those chains anywhere along so we can see exactly what each part is doing. Now, I don't know about you, but I've just been disconnecting and reconnecting and slicing for ages without knowing this particular shortcut. And you can get stacks of more handy shortcuts like that from our Blender shortcut PDF, link in the description. Okay, it's already looking pretty atmospheric in our scene here, but we can go one step further by adding a little bit of ground fog. Now, ground fog is great, particularly for sandy desert vibes, steampunk, or just a cold, humid day. Okay, in order to set this up, we kind of need some geometry to start with, so I'm going to select our little dust particles here and just hit H on the keyboard to temporarily hide them to afford us a little more space to draw in our cube. And this will be where our ground fog is. So I'm going to start at the back here like we did before and just draw out something kind of like this. This time, I think we want our ground fog to be localized within the ground plane. So let's give it a little bit of height here. We don't really want to go beyond that, and jump on over to our material options, selecting our boundary select tool again, clicking new and naming it ground fog. Now, if we move our UI over a little bit and change on over to our shader editor, you can see we have our principal BSDF. We don't want that, so we can select it, hit X, and instead search for principal volume and plug that into the volume option. Okay, and we already see some very thick fog going on, which is, it's cool, but it's not the effect we want. So let's affect the density. And to do so, we can drag out and hook up, you've guessed it, a gradient. So we can lock that in, change it on over to spherical like before. And again, we have that being affected by one of the corners of the cube here. So we want to reorient our coordinates by dragging out from our vector and searching for coordinates. And this time we want our object. And you can see, it's very faint, but you can see we have it here just by the knee is our little bit of volume fog. Now we can affect that position even further by introducing a mapping node. So plugging that vector mapping node in between, we can go down here. I'm just going to click and drag down for all the channels of our scale. Hold Shift for a finer control and move our values down. And you can see our fog starting to appear. Okay, looks good. Now I want to move it down along the Z. So I'm going to hold Shift and do that. Something like that looks good. Now I know this looks a bit like a dome at the moment, but we're going to break it up with another texture. And that texture is a Musgrave. So let's give ourselves a little bit of space and search for Musgrave texture. Now we want to multiply these two together. So let's introduce a math node change it to multiply, and hook in our Musgrave. And you can see we have some additional texture set up here, but before we refine any further, let's make sure they're using the same texture coordinates. As you can see, this makes the Musgrave pattern very small, so let's reduce this so we have a larger pattern scale. Let's go with something like that. Now I want more detail, it's looking very soft, so I'm going to go to 10. And then dimension, we're going to reduce that down so we start getting some more granular details. Something like that looks pretty good to me. Now we can refine this further, if you're finding it particularly difficult to see, by hooking up our height output to our surface. And now we can see, we go up to the top here as well, just go into / to isolate our Musgrave texture over the surface, and you can see the kind of details you're going to get when ultimately rendering out the volume, like so. This becomes particularly handy when animating said Musgrave texture, because like we did with the dust particles, we want to animate this over time. But within Blender's material shaders, we don't have that scene time value that we did in geometry nodes, but we can create it with a regular value. So if we switch our Musgrave over to 4D and our W input, we drag that out and just start typing in value. If we click into our value here, we can type hashtag frame. And this just gives us the frame of our animation, like so. So when we play through, you can see how it animates. Now this is tricky to see, particularly with how Blender iteratively builds up the samples of volumetrics. So if we switch on over to our render settings, we can turn our viewport samples down to 1. This gives us a better indication because it only has to sample once for the viewport. But again, if we want to really see what that Musgrave texture is doing, we can hook the height output into our surface and then see that, yes, the animation is happening way too fast for some nice, gentle, undulating fog. So let's introduce a math node set to multiply to reduce this value down a bit. Let's go with 0.01. Now let's play through. That feels a lot nicer. But we don't really want it just undulating in one spot. We want the smoke to be sort of moving down, like it's sort of falling to the ground. So we can do that with another mapping node. I'm just going to collapse this using this little arrow here and search again for a mapping node. Now we can animate the Z-axis here to have it falling to the ground gently. First of all, we only want to address the Z-axis, so we need to take advantage of a combine vector. And now we can use our animation here and plug that just into our Z-axis. Okay, let's see what's happening. Okay, it's doing it, but again, incredibly fast. So let's take our animation reducer, if you like, our multiply here, Shift-D to duplicate it and place it here. And now it's moving down ever so slowly, as well as undulating using the 4D, the extra dimension of our Musgrave texture. Okay, I think we don't need to see the surface details anymore, so we can remove that. And we're just left with our fog, which feels, yes, that feels a lot nicer to me. As a final tweak here, I'm just going to introduce a gamma node at the end of everything and just reduce it ever so slightly by increasing that gamma value. And if you want to refine the contrast of your Musgrave texture again, we can use the map range node, plug that in, and just take our black levels or our from or input blacks or our from minimum down a little bit till we start seeing our smoke. Okay, great, that looks good. And now if we go back here and up our samples, you can see that eventually it will be a lot cleaner. In fact, I think we can tweak our minimum almost back to 0 here. That's looking good. And Alt-H to unhide all of our nice dust particles. And we're ready to render our scene. Okay, this is where we started. And now with the radial glow, the floor, the dust particles, and the ground fog. I hope these little techniques help you with the presentation of your models, and if you do use any, then feel free to @CG Boost on the various social media channels. I look forward to seeing them. And if you want to create some robots from scratch, then I think you're going to really like the Robotic Planet course. We walk through creating procedural edgeware, dirt, and jet thrusters, as well as going through the production of a full animated scene. Modeling, rigging, animation, render, the works. So if that sounds good to you, then you can jump on over to a link in the description. I'll see you there.